Good evening, everybody. Erev Tov. Once again, please have phones switched off. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Begin Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the latest in our series on the prime ministers that we're calling The Buck Stops Here. This is actually the fourth in our series, although we're dealing with the third prime minister. Some of you will hear we're here for our discussion on Golda Meir. We switched around Golda and Levi Eshkol just to do with availability of speakers. But I think you'll agree that that was an amazing event, those of you that were here for that. Some of you will be listening to this on recording on our podcast. If you're a podcast listener, check out our podcast. It's called Leading Conversations for the podcast, and we have a lot of very, very interesting discussions on that as well in this series and elsewhere. Okay. I'm in the curious situation of introducing a speaker who both has a very long and impressive biography and also who needs no introduction. I will nevertheless give a short introduction of Ambassador Michael Oren, who is a historian, a novelist, a diplomat, a politician. He served as Israel's ambassador to the United States from 2009 to 2013, playing a pivotal role in Israeli-American relations during a very, shall we say, complicated period. He immigrated to Israel from the United States after being educated at Columbia and Princeton. He went on to serve in the IDF and the Knesset and as deputy minister in the Prime Minister's office. He's the author of several best-selling books, including, of course, 6 Days of War. Still, I think, by some distance, the single best book on the 6-Day War out there. You should read it if you have not. And also Ally, which is an amazing account of his time in Washington. Ambassador Michael Oren, welcome. Thank you so much.
Always good. Thank you, Paul. That's good.
So, as I said, we're going to be discussing Levi Eshkol, obviously Prime Minister during the 6-Day War, which we'll be discussing, took over from Ben-Gurion when he resigned for the second time in 63 and served until his death in 69. I know, obviously, during your research for your wonderful book on the 6-Day War, you must have discovered a huge amount about him and done a lot of research. What can you tell us that sticks out? Are there any interesting things that we won't know about him, about this man?
Well, let me begin with like two short anecdotes about Levi Eshkol. Keep in mind that, here's the book. This is in Hebrew. Thank you for plugging it. Now available for famously reduced prices. 6 Days of War, Shisha Yamim Shel Milchama in Hebrew. I knew nothing about this guy. Growing up as an American Jewish kid in the 60s, living through the period of the 6-Day War was right before my bar mitzvah. Now I've aged myself. Who was Levi Eshkol? We all knew Moshe Dayan. We all knew Yitzhak Rabin. Who is this guy? And I started doing research for this book a long time ago, about 1998, 1999. I started encountering this man. Who was Levi Eshkol? And slowly, it dawned on me that this Levi Eshkol was the great hero of the 6-Day War, the unsung hero of Israel history, and more than that, that he was Israel's greatest prime minister. Now, Shabbat lunch last week, around a typical Israeli table. What are we talking about? We're talking about politics, right? We're talking about who's running for prime minister, who's good, who's bad. And my host turns up to me, and he was a veteran pilot from the IAF. It was an ace from the 1973 Yom Kippur War. He says to me, who do you think was the best prime minister in Israel's history? I said, well, Levi Eshkol. He said, you're absolutely right. Levi Eshkol was the best prime minister we had because he wasn't a leader, he was a manager. What Israel needs now is a manager. More about that later. In time, after writing this book, another book, someone mentioned it before, Power, Faith, and Fantasy, about America's involvement in the Middle East, I became ambassador. And I was named ambassador by the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, with whom I had very little connection. I was never a member of the Likud, wasn't involved in politics. And it's usually, this is Israel's premier diplomatic position in the world. Why and how would I get into connection with Benjamin Netanyahu? And the answer is this. Levi Eshkol died in February 1969, about a year and a half after the 6-Day War, and 74 years old. and buried on Mount Zion, about on Herzl. And every February, in the cold and the rain, because I had been close to Eshkol, because I got close to his widow, Miriam Eshkol, who lived on Rashbas Street, a great lady. She would let me look at, she had an archive all of her own of Levi Eshkol papers, and she would let me read a couple of papers every time I came to visit her, right? In return for eating a piece of cheesecake that was about the size of this table, about 5,000 calories. And I got filled with great information about Levi Eshkol and put on about 15 pounds. Just the last thing, she also had an effigy of Golda Meir hanging over her stove that was half burnt, halfway up. Now, I'm going to say this in Hebrew, I'll translate it. I said, one day I couldn't stand it anymore. I said, Miriam, maze. She says, zo yididi, nekama. Can't make this up. So I got very close to the Eshkol family. And I would go up to, in that freezing cold, up to Mount Herzl to stand by his grave. And there was a man who showed up every single time without television cameras, with minimal security. And that man was Benjamin Netanyahu, who it turns out also regarded Eshkol as Israel's greatest prime minister. And it became a connection between us. And afterwards, we would retire to Miriam's house on Rashba Street, and we would schmooze. And so in a crazy way, studying Eshkol and learning who he was for this book resulted in my being dispatched to Washington. Go figure that one out. So two anecdotes about Levi Eshkol and me. So why Eshkol? Who was this man? I mean, he was the anti-hero. He didn't care how he dressed. He didn't care that much how he spoke. He wasn't very articulate. He was the antithesis of the Sabra ideal, which was Yitzhak Rabin. He was very diasporic, galuti, spoke with an accent. Half of his sentences were in Yiddish. Studying him, I had to learn what Yiddish was. I had to learn what Jungerman was. Every time Eshkol, or every time Diane or Yigal Yadin, Yigal Alon would walk into his office, he'd say, Makole Jungerman, Or he referred to Israel. What was he referred to Israel as? Shimshon the Nebuchadnezzar. We're Shimshon, we're also the Nebuch, all right? Or as Diane once said to John Foster Dulles, Israel is in danger of being destroyed right now, and yet our army can be in Damascus in 3 days. At the same time, Shimshon the Nebuch. And yet he was a man who had no heirs, didn't care anything for money, and an exquisite sense of humor. There's actually a great book, a collection of the wit of Levi Eshkol. Some of the things that are Eshkolisms, you didn't know they're from Eshkol. For example, how do you make a small fortune in Israel? That's Eshkol. But he was a man of great action. Here's a person who became the head of Israel's defense ministry during the 1948 war, who somehow got us through that war, a war that began in May 1948, where the IDF had enough bullets to fight for 1 week, with no tanks, no guns, no airplanes, and somehow Eshkol pulled this together. Then during the 1950s, what's known as Yemei Tzena, where there wasn't enough bread to feed the population of this country. And literally tens of thousands of immigrants were arriving, many of them very destitute Holocaust survivors, arriving every week and being put in mabarot, in these temporary housing encampments. He somehow pulled this off. He got flour. He got food for this population, made tzena. He built 400 communities and settlements. Levi Eshkol. He established Mikorot, our national water system. Later on, he would build the National Warrior Carrier. This is as an economics minister, finance minister, which brought water from the Sea of Galilee down to the Negev to irrigate the Negev. You can still visit the Eshkol Reservoir in Lower Galilee. This was his vision, the National Water Carrier, Movil Artzi. And he built up the IDF. He brought in the best and the brightest. He was the one who promoted Yitzhak Rabin, extended his term in office in 1967, 66 for one more year, and he doubled the budget of the IDF and modernized it. I mean, this is the army that came out of the 1950s, still sort of like a summer camp with guns, and made it what it was. This was Eshkol. But what really made Eshkol, to my mind, Israel's greatest prime minister was the way he handled the fateful crisis that began at the end of May 1967 and eventually evolved into what we call the Six-Day War. And that was to study Eshkol and the way and his diplomacy and his crisis management is to really study, almost to receive a primer and how to be a responsible and far-sighted leader during that period. And so, you read all these documents about one person, you'd think he'd come away very, very critical. Everything I read about this man left me more and more deeply impressed. So there you have it.
I mean, just before we get to the Six-Day War, just if you can just tell us a little bit about his emergence as prime minister. He was Ben-Gurion's pick to succeed him?
He was Ben-Gurion's pick as poodle.
Right.
So let's explain that. So Eshkol comes from the Pale of Settlement. His background is Yiddish. It's Hasidut. It's Orthodox Judaism and Zionut. Comes an early convert to Zionism. Made Aliyah when he was 19 years old. He's one of the founders of Kibbutz Degania on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, Israel's first kibbutz. One of the founders of the Histrodut. One of the founders of Mapai, what would later become Mapai. A socialist, but a person, in theory secular, but with that deep, of that generation of Israeli secularists who knew what they had left in the Cheder, right? And very much well versed in Tanakh and in Talmud. And he worked his way through the ranks. He would what you would call, a bureaucrat today, a factotum, right? He wasn't a great soldier. He served for a bit in the British Army during World War I, but nothing like, he wasn't a great military hero, wasn't a great scholar, all right? But he was a hard worker, and he worked his way up through the ranks. Remember, he was in the defense ministry in 1948, and then in terms of an economic minister throughout the 1950s into 1961, and he was, protege of Ben-Gurion, and a person who, because he was rather a gray figure, as opposed to Ben-Gurion, the flamboyant Ben-Gurion, never posed a threat. And so when Ben-Gurion resigned for the second time as your manager, the first time was in 1953, and Sharet took over in 1963 against the background of a number of issues. One was the continuation of the Lavon affair. There's a strong theory out there that it had to do with, that Ben-Gurion's resignation had to do with his very bad meeting with John F. Kennedy at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. By the way, Ben-Gurion never visited the White House. No prime minister visited the White House before Levi Eshkol in 1964, the first prime minister to visit the White House. Now we think nothing about it, right? But back then it was a big thing. Prime minister visiting the White House. No, Ben-Gurion met with Kennedy at the Waldorf Astoria in New York and had a very difficult discussion about Dimona. Very difficult. And Ben-Gurion thought, well, I've got to get out of this. I better resign. And then I'll just resign for a while and, wait for the Kennedy era to pass. And I'll come back, and I just need someone to sort of a placeholder, someone who's not going to give problems. And who does he appoint? He appoints Levi Eshkol. And to Ben-Gurion's chagrin / shock, Eshkol turns out to be an excellent prime minister. Israel's economy is growing by 11% per year, believe it or not. Isn't that amazing? 11% per year. He's strengthening the IDF. He is standing up to the Histrodut, which wants to go on strike every day, his own Histrodut. And he extends Israel's foreign relations. He had no experience in foreign relations, Eshkol, but he built relations with Africa. When I used to visit Miriam Eshkol's apartment on Rochborough Street, it was still full of spears and arrows. It was like a time capsule from 1964. Were
they aimed at the Golda Meir statue?
Well, she gave, you're not going to believe this, she gave my wife as a gift the mink stole. Think of this, Israel, 1964, like a mint wrap, all right, mink wrap that she had worn to the White House. It's amazing. And it was, I don't know who made mink stoles in Israel in 1960. It had a label inside it. I gave it as a gift to the Eshkol library here in Rehavia. It's a piece of history. But so he built foreign relations with Asia, and he began to establish this relationship with the United States. Keep in mind that we did not have a strategic alliance with the United States. We had a friendly relationship, and sometimes not so friendly. We had a very unfriendly relationship with the Eisenhower administration.
Right.
1957, Eisenhower wanted to put sanctions on Israel because of the Suez crisis. The Senate stopped him. And then Kennedy came after us about Dimona, very hard. It's interesting we have this, Kennedy Center in the Jerusalem forest, but he wasn't a great friend. And yet, Eshkol establishes a rapport with Lyndon Johnson. Look at their pictures; they kind of look alike. They do, right? Think Eshkol, think Johnson. They kind of look alike. They were both farmers. They both came from simple background, and Lyndon Johnson respected this man. We have a lot, he's a sachbak. And they had this rapport. And Eshkol was the first one to enter into negotiations for the purchase of American armaments. And Patton tanks, which at the time the M60 was the most powerful tank in the Middle East. The only country that had them was Jordan. And Skyhawk and Phantom jets. Now, they didn't arrive until after the Six-Day War, unfortunately. We had to go up against those Patton tanks against the Jordanians. But he was the first one to discuss the possibility of getting offensive weaponry from the United States. And this was a sea change. And this is all happening very, very, very fast. This is happening between basically 1963 and 1966. And Ben-Gurion is so taken aback by this, is so shocked that this gray eminence of Levi Eshkol was posing a threat to his preeminence, that Ben-Gurion created an extra party. He created Rafi to contest with the Labor Party of Levi Eshkol. And Rafi, Ben-Gurion gathers his acolytes, Moshe Dayan, Shimon Peres, around him, and they begin to pose a threat to the government of Levi Eshkol. And this is the background to May 1967, when Eshkol enters his first sort of a mini crisis with the United States over whether to have a parade in Jerusalem to celebrate Israel's 19th anniversary. And remember, at the time, Jerusalem's divided, and it had very strict regulations about what kind of armaments you could show in Jerusalem. And Rafi, and also Rahal, under Begin, wanted to have tanks and guns paraded in the streets of Jerusalem. And the Americans said, no tanks, no guns. That's a violation of the 1949 armistice agreements with Jordan. And so Eshkol, famous Eshkol story, they used to say that he was a great compromiser, that when a waitress asked him whether he wanted tea or coffee, what did he say? Half of each. Okay. What does he say to Americans? We'll have a parade with soldiers, with guns, but no tanks and no artillery pieces. And so he's attacked by both the right and the left for agreeing to this compromise. And it's during those celebrations, on Israel's 19th birthday, Yom HaAtzmaut, okay, May 23rd, 1967, while everyone is singing Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, it was the hit song of that week, right? Word comes that the Egyptians have just kicked the United Nations emergency force out of Egypt, that the Egyptian army is streaming into Egypt. And in the next few days, we would find out that the Egyptians would also close the Straits of Tiran, basically cutting off Israel's southern port of Eilat, which was an act of war, an act of belligerency. And the big question is, how and to what extent would Israel respond?
Last time when we heard about Golda Meir, one of the issues that we discussed was the way that she's remembered, and perhaps unfairly or fairly, depending on how you see it, but certainly with regard to the Yom Kippur War. And I think in the case of Levi Eshkol, despite all the positive things that you're saying, there is this view of Levi Eshkol as the prime minister who gave a sort of bumbling address on radio, which didn't inspire confidence, and then you had people inside Israel, including Menachem Begin, going and to Ben-Gurion of all people and asking him to come and take over. And in the end, Dayan comes in as defense minister to sort of shore things up and inspire more confidence. And that you do get this picture from that, at least, of Eshkol, of perhaps a flaw in Eshkol, that he wasn't charismatic enough, and he didn't project the kind of leadership that the country needed at that time. Do you accept that, or do you
No, I totally
refute that?
accept it. I'll even make it a finer point. Listen, one of the great qualities of any leader is a decision maker. Got to be a good politician to be a leader. You also have to be a great communicator. You know, I think if you see me a lot on the news, and I have to go on the news and say one of the great failings of America's involvement in the most recent war in Iran was the failure of the Trump administration to explain the war adequately to the population of the United States. And the people living, many places in the United States never even heard of Iran, know what it's like. Why should we be paying more gas at the gas station for a war we don't even know what's going on? And so explaining a war, being a communicator, is extremely important skill for a leader. Look at Churchill in World War II, or Roosevelt, or Lincoln, who are great communicators. Levi Eshkol was not a good communicator. And, that image of him sort of being, this diasporic, rumbled older man didn't serve him well. And then he had an unfortunate incident. I think it's on June 2nd. And at this point, not only is the Egyptian army has remilitarized Sinai, the Straits of Tiran are closed, but the entire Arab world now is in a frenzy, making defense contracts with Egypt, the Iraqis, the Jordanians. King Hussein of Jordan puts the Jordanian army under Egyptian command. Believe it or not, the Egyptian generals show up in Jordan, take over this army, a very powerful army. In the War of Independence, we didn't win one battle against the Jordanian Legion, not one. You can imagine that. We were afraid of Jordan back then. And they had 60s, they had 100 of these patent tanks. There was nothing we had that was comparable to that. The Syrians as well, and the Syrians fully backed by the Soviets. I mean, some of you are my generation, I hate to say this, and there was a book written back then called If Israel Had Lost the Six-Day War. And some of us read this book when we were kids, and it had a big impact on us. But the notion of Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian tanks rumbling through the streets of Tel Aviv, or what remained of them, was a real image, was a real nightmare. Right?
Great mass graves were dug. Mass graves.
They dug 20,000 graves around the country, and they said it wasn't going to be enough.
Right.
It wasn't going to be enough. And meanwhile, the entire reserves have been called up, but Israel was not a high-tech country back then. It was an agrarian company. So the orange and the apples are rotting on the trees, and all these reservists are sitting around. And for Israelis who lived through that period, what they remember is not the glorious victory of 1967. They remember Tkufat Amtana, the period of waiting, 3 weeks. There's the only period I know in Israeli history where Israeli mothers of soldiers and wives of soldiers went out to protest in front of the prime minister's office because the government wasn't going to war. Not amazing?
Right.
Wasn't they pro-war protests?
The opposite of the mothers
In Lebanon.
Yeah.
Everyone's mothers ever since then, or around there, protesting. And the economy is in danger of tanking. And Eshkol has to deal with two fronts of his own. One is within his own government, where there are ministers pressing him to go to war, go to war, go to war. By the way, the most dovish ministers back then was Mafdal.
The national religious poet.
So was Moshe Chaim Shapiro.
Interesting.
Zalman Aran, Zerach Waldhaftik, who I interviewed for this book, lovely little man. They were leftist. Mafdal was a leftist party back then. Right? National Religious was leftist. They switched a bit. And they're pressing back and forth. And then the army, the general staff. And this is the general staff, not of today. This is a general staff where every general on that general staff was something of a national figure. You had Arik Sharon and Mati Peled and Shlomo Gazit and really powerful figures, every one of them. And in one night, poor Eshkol gets out of a government meeting where they've beaten the living daylights out of him, and he goes down to the bor, the pit in the Kiryah, the underground headquarters, and the generals jump at him. And Sharon says, "You're endangering the state of Israel. You're endangering the future of the Jewish people if you don't go to war." Then on top of everything else, after that, he has a terrible flu. Miriam used to tell me this. He has a terrible flu, and he gets a text of a speech to read to people on national radio. You know, he goes to Helena Malka Street, which is Israeli radio, is still there, and a studio, and he gets a text where everything has been crossed out. And there's lines in this. And he starts reading it and starts stumbling over words.
Mm.
And in Hebrew, it's known as a Ne'um Megam, right? The stuttered speech. And people go into a panic. They said that people were listening to the radio and crying from panic. No kidding.
Wow.
And because everyone's facing an existential threat, and here their prime minister comes across as someone who can't put a sentence together. And it was a crisis. And that crisis really leads to the point where Eshkol has to make one of the most difficult decisions of his time in office. And that is, on one hand, to declare a national unity government, to bring Begin into the government. And by the way, he was the first prime minister of this period to actually have a conversation with Begin, because Begin, you know, Ben-Gurion used to refer to that man sitting in that chair over there. And it was Eshkol who also brought Jabotinsky's bones back to Israel, he should know. So he had a rapport with the revisionists that Ben-Gurion never had. He brought Begin in, and Begin had a very productive, you should know, role in the 1967 war, very productive and very responsible. But he also had agreed to make Moshe Dayan defense minister, because Ben-Gurion had always been prime minister and defense minister. Right? Those positions were routinely united during this period in Israel's history. And he was also defense minister, Eshkol, and he had to divide it and bring in Moshe Dayan, who was a member of Rafi. He was actually in many ways a greater adversary than Begin was. And bring in Moshe Dayan to the government. Dayan comes in as an anti-war figure in the government. You tear closer to Mafdal than he was to Begin.
Wow.
And but as I think the most difficult biography anybody can ever write is about Moshe Dayan. Totally impenetrable as a person, who goes from saying, I'm against war, to advancing the war, to saying, we're getting off the track here, to saying, if any Israeli soldier reaches the Suez Canal in this war, I'm personally going to shoot him, to then pushing the army toward the Suez Canal, to being against the liberation of Jerusalem, to then taking credit for the liberation of Jerusalem, to being against the conquest of the Golan Heights, to then giving the order to conquer the Golan Heights on June 8th without consulting anybody, not even the chief of staff, not Rabin, and not Eshkol in the government. Great, that's Dayan. Okay.
Didn't Eshkol threaten to court-martial him?
Yeah, they were going to. Well, there had been a discussion in the government on June 8th in the afternoon not to conquer the Golan Heights.
Wow.
The question is whether Dayan had committed treason. Like, literally, you can't make this up.
Wow.
But this is Eshkol. Eshkol's got to deal with all this and deal with Dayan. He used to call him Abu Jildi. Jildi was a Palestinian Arab one-eyed bandit of the 1930s. And he said, what is Abu Jildi going to say? You know, he had names, he had nicknames for everybody. And he had to deal with all these people, with this general staff, with the mothers protesting in the street, with people accusing him of being incompetent and inarticulate. And what is going on behind all this scene is his relationship, Eshkol's relationship with the world, with Europe, with the Soviet Union, and above all, with the United States of America. And that is the real drama of what's going on here.
Because the US presumably at the time is enmeshed in Vietnam and is not particularly keen to get involved in another foreign.
Or as President Johnson said 3 times to Abba Eban when he came to the White House that week, Israel will not be alone unless it decides to be alone.
Huh.
All right. Rather, they subjected this to rather, midrashic scrutiny. What did he mean by that? What did he mean by that? We're going to be alone. We're not going to be alone. But it was clear that the Johnson administration was against Israel going to war. Johnson administration comes up with this notion that we're going to put together an international convoy to challenge the Egyptian blockade of the Strait of Tiran. And if the Egyptians open fire on the convoy, the U.S. Navy and other navies will return fire. To the degree that if you go into the archives, you'll see how the U.S. Navy actually picked out targets in Egypt that they were going to strike if they were hit. And Johnson was saying to Eshkol all the time, just give me time, give me another week, give me another week. Meanwhile, Eshkol's facing all what he's facing inside the government, in the street, and in the bowl. Give me another week. And Eshkol said to everyone who was listening to him, we have to exhaust every possible diplomatic alternative before we go to war. Because when we go to war, we have to have the United States on our side. Now, in the background is that Abba Eban goes to Britain to meet with Prime Minister Wilson. He goes to France to meet with de Gaulle. Wilson said, I'm not with you. De Gaulle said, not only am I not with you, I'm switching to the other side. No, he switched over side overnight, switched to the Arab side. So the only, everything depends on the United States of America. And who's going to stand up to the Soviet Union? Because the Soviet Union was backing the Arabs on this. Egypt, Syria, Iraq were all aligned with the Soviet Union. Jordan wasn't, but Jordan wasn't even in control of its own army anymore. The Egyptians were. So what do you do with the Johnson telling you stop, 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 and your people are telling you go, 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 go? And how did he get out of it? And he got out of it by being very patient, putting up with it. I personally think that he died a year and a half after the Six-Day War. I think they killed him.
Wow.
I think the tension was just so incredible, unbearable. And he sends the head of the Mossad, Miramit, to Washington. Now, the Mossad had a close relationship with the CIA at the time, probably closer than most other aspects of Israeli governance. And Miramit comes back after meeting with Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, and says to Eshkol, we have a yellow light. What does that mean? Is it a flashing yellow light? Is it more red? Is it more green? What are the shades? You see a bunch of Jews sitting on the table having this conversation. And he says, listen, Amit said to him, listen, they're not going to give you approval to go to war. But if we can stick it to Nasser, they'll be okay. They'll be happy if we can, literally quote, as we said, stick it to Nasser. How are you going to stick it to Nasser? Then the next question is, okay, you're going to make this decision to go to war. The cabinet votes on it. It's exactly divided, 5 against 5.
Wow.
5 against 5. By the way, I'll tell you more about what I'm doing now, but I'm doing a book on this current war. And on October 7th, the cabinet was divided 5 against 5 about ways to respond to the Hamas attack. It's very interesting.
Wow. Okay.
And there are lots of other parallels we'll get into.
Yeah,
But
we should.
5 against 5. So there wasn't even a consensus in the government that we have to go to war just now. And Eshkol decides to go to war. And he spends that night, doesn't sleep. He writes a letter to Johnson explaining what he's about to do. And he has to say, okay, how do you go to war? And they come up with this extraordinary, crazy notion that we're going to send almost the entire Israeli Air Force up into the air, with the exception of 13 planes that are going to be left to guard the skies over Tel Aviv and Haifa. And we're going to destroy the entire Egyptian Air Force aircraft on the ground. On the ground. The largest military air operation in history. Crazy. Most successful one. Same time, Eshkol writes a letter to King Hussein of Jordan saying, what's about to transpire is between us and Nasser. You stay out of it, we'll stay out of it. Huh. Had no desire to go to war with King Hussein. They'd had contacts with King Hussein. And the Syrians, there was no question. They didn't want to get involved with the Syrians. No plan to conquer the Golan Heights. And by the way, even the operation against Egypt was only directed at the first of 3 Egyptian defense lines. It was simply to move the Egyptians away from the southern border, the threat from the Egypt. So it had very limited goals. The key was knocking out the Egyptian Air Force. Because Egyptian was huge, 400 airplanes. Wow. And the notion was that if somehow this Israeli operation failed, then Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities would be demolished, would be waylaid. And that was a vision. It was a real vision. So think about the decision that this man had to make. Yeah. After this 3 weeks of hell, no sleep, all this tension, and he makes this decision. Wow. Wow. Because one of the great qualities of any outstanding leader is decision-making. Yeah. The guy made a decision, and when he's made a decision, he's stuck with it. And then the drama begins. If it's not enough drama now, okay, I always say you have to work really hard to make this story dull. Because it's every page is like, wow, wow, wow. Yeah. And what happens is that the Israeli-Egyptian army fades, collapses farther than anybody anticipated, and the Israeli army is literally sucked into Sinai. Sucked into Sinai. And 2 days later, the Israeli army finds itself on the banks of the Suez Canal. Wasn't supposed to get there. Diane doesn't shoot anybody. Then the Jordanian army under Egyptian command, King Hussein didn't want to go to war, but the Egyptian commanders gave an order, and so they began to attack Israel, not far from where you live, on Armon Netziv. Armon
Say
Netziv.
it.
There was two plans. One was to have those Patton tanks come up from the Jordan Valley to attack Har Safim, and the other to have Jordanian land troops go through Armon Netziv, right? And up right, you can visit the bunker still near near Ramat Rachel. And in the Israeli command, they thought that the Jordanian army was doing what they had done in 1948, which was to surround West Jerusalem on the north and the south and cut it off. And so there begins. Then the paratroopers who were supposed to jump in the El Arish area are rushed on buses up to Jerusalem without maps, without proper equipment or arms, and sent into a battle in Jerusalem. There was no plan to conquer Jerusalem. No plan to conquer the old city of Jerusalem, none whatsoever. And several times, the commander of the paratroopers, Mota Gore, calls the government and says, listen, I could get into like the Newgate. They were at the Rockefeller Museum. I can get into the Newgate. It's right across the street here, near the Notre Dame Hotel. And the government says, no, we cannot go into Jerusalem. The people who most opposed going to Jerusalem were Mafdal. Why did Mafdal, of all people, oppose the paratroopers going to the Kotel? Because Chaim Moshe Shapiro, by the way, whose grandson was Adner Shapiro, killed on October 7th, Alav Shalom, and Verhaftig and Zalman Aran were afraid that if we conquered the old city, that the Christian world would come down on us and force us to give it up. And that the Jewish people could not bear the thought of losing the Kotel again.
Because the Christians wouldn't
let Jews take over the holy places, Christianity. The Jews would be in charge of the holy site, believe it or not.
Wow.
And then Moshe Dayan was against it too. He says, I don't want any of that Vatican, he said. We don't need that Vatican, quote unquote.
Wow.
And on the morning of June 7th, here's a story which when I saw this letter in the British archives in Kew, and I held this letter and I literally stood up in my chair and said, oh my God. A letter written by Eshkol on the morning of June 7th, all right? The war begins on June 5th. This is now the third morning of the war, saying to King Hussein, my paratroopers have now surrounded the old city. We can take the old city, but we won't take the old city if you meet three conditions. If you evict the Egyptian commanders from your army, if you agree to immediate and unconditional ceasefire, and if you enter into peace talks with the state of Israel. Now, here is the leader of the first Jewish state in 2,000 years who has the ability to reunite the old city of Jerusalem, the Kotel, our holiest site, Har Habayit, with the Jewish state, and he's willing to forego it for the chance of peace with one Arab country.
Wow.
And this letter, only one copy of this letter that I've been able to find is in the British archives. There are references to it even in Hussein's memoirs, and Hussein doesn't answer. This letter went out at 7 in the morning. At 9 o'clock or 9:30 in the morning, the paratroopers were then at the top of Har Zaitim, Mount of Olives. That famous picture, that's not the picture on this book, but on the English cover.
Yeah, yeah.
And 2.5 hours later, the paratroopers respond to Eshkol, Har Habayit b'yadenu.
Yeah.
Just a sort of an epilogue to that. One of the most iconic pictures of the Six-Day War is a picture of Dayan and Rabin walking with helmets into the old city. You know that picture.
What's an Narkis?
I'm sorry, Narkis, Dayan, all right, are walking in there. There's a guy who's half turned behind them.
Right.
That's Rechavam Ze'evi, Gandhi, who the photographer said, hey, you get out of the picture. And he didn't quite get out of the picture. But why is Eshkol not in that picture? You're not going to believe this. Literally, you can't make this up. Eshkol calls Dayan's office and says, I hear that we're at the Kotel. I want to go down the Kotel. And Dayan's office says, no, it's too dangerous. There are snipers. Dayan is meanwhile running down there with a photographer. So he can claim credit. Lo naim, Rabin played almost no role in the Six-Day War. Though later, the keychains came out with Rabin's picture on it. And if you came to Israel early in the 70s, you had cigarette packs with Rabin's pictures on them. Rabin had a physical and nervous breakdown before the war and did not come back to make he is not involved in any major decision of the war. And only on that, he takes that picture, But other than that, he had no real role in the war, unfortunately. Unfortunately, terrible thing. He was under such immense pressure. But Eshkol never folded. That's the thing. You have a man, Yitzhak Rabin collapses under the pressure of that waiting period. But Eshkol didn't. Eshkol didn't. And that contributed to my conclusion that here was truly a great leader. And by the way, I think Netanyahu reached the same conclusion.
Do you think that you mentioned at the beginning that he was one of the reasons he was such a great prime minister was that he was a great manager? Do you think that type of leader was required for this because he had to deal with, I mean, for one thing, he had to deal with like the egos in his cabinet and people like that. You needed someone. I mean, was he delegating to people like Dayan and?
No, I think he understood that he was dealing with Diane. You were dealing with an unknown quantity. How should I say? A very protean quantity. It was changing all the time. Who knows where Diane was? And you had, strong figures like Begin who wanted a very specific thing. Begin was very much about getting into the old city.
Right.
But you had the Mapam members of the government who were, socialist, left wing, who didn't want to go to war, didn't want to go into the old city, didn't want to take the Golan Heights, didn't want to. What Eshkol had was a clarity of vision. And I'll give a plug. I have a Substack called Clarity. If you're interested, the editor here is Aviva. Say hi. And I call it Clarity. And I call it clarity because I think clarity is to me the most important attribute of any great leader. And it's also one of the rarest. And Eshkol had clarity. He saw that Israel had to maintain a relationship with the United States at the time, that Israel could not go to war without having exhausted all diplomatic options. And he was willing to pay a price. He was willing to pay a personal price, a political price. People just belittled him all the time. There were songs against him that made fun of him. Nasser's waiting for Rabin, he's not waiting for Eshkol, and got no credit. By the way, the poll taken after the war, who deserved the most credit for the victory in the Six-Day War? The lion's share went to Rabin and Dayan. Only 10% of Israelis thought that Eshkol deserved any credit for winning the Six-Day War. Wow. 10%. Wow. And it's amazing. And again, I knew nothing about this man. I barely had heard his name. And it was, for me, one of the most enlightening and impressive and inspiring stories I'd ever encountered as an historian.
Amazing. So I want to go to questions from the audience shortly. Before I do, maybe you mentioned the parallels to today. And when you talk about the closing of the Straits of Tehran, these days, I think most of us, when we hear the word Straits, we're waiting for the words of Hormuz afterwards. Because
I can't tell you how many times I've made that faux pas on radio. I keep on referring to the Straits of Tehran.
I'm sure. So
laugh at me. Yeah.
Can you say a little about the parallels of a situation where the straits are being closed and it's affecting shipping and we're dealing with Israel-US relations in a very real way?
So where's the parallel? Okay, we have a strait. And the Middle East has a couple of these, right? Bab el-Mandeb. And the difference between Tehran and Hormuz is Hormuz, 20% of the world's oil supply goes to Hormuz, and entire economies, if not the entire global economy, is dependent on oil traffic through there. The only economy that was dependent on the Straits of Tehran and traffic through the Straits of Tehran was Israel's economy. So a little bit of a difference. And yet, the notion of somehow recruiting an international convoy, right, to go through it and challenge it, was raised by Johnson, but also raised by President Trump. And Trump had no more success than Johnson had. Johnson approached 27 different countries to contribute ships. I think only one, the Danes, said that they would contribute ships. Nobody else would. And Trump turned to the Europeans, and guess what? Nothing. No one was willing to contribute ships to reopening a strait. So, when they say that Iran has created a precedent for closing a vital international waterway, it's not quite true. There actually is a precedent that's earlier than that. And the Egyptians had closed the Straits of Tehran in 1956 as well, which helped precipitate the Sinai campaign. It wasn't the first time. Now we have given a green light for Saudi Arabia to annex Tehran Island and make it into a tourist attraction. It was part of the effort to create a Saudi-Israeli peace agreement before October 7th. Was the Tehran Agreement, you should know. So it became a basis for peace later on. And which is interesting, a side note there. So there's the comparison. The comparison that a strait can be closed by a hostile Middle Eastern country, and the international community is not going to do anything to reopen it. And unless you're willing to reopen it yourself, guess what? You're going to have a closure. Maybe you get a break for about 60 days, but at the end of the day, they're going to come back and collect tolls. Yeah. So there you go. There's one parallel.
What's that phrase? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
It rhymes. It's Mark Twain. Yes, it rhymes. So that's certainly a parallel. The other parallel is, of course, what price is Israel willing to pay in terms of its fundamental security to remain on the same page with the United States of America, right. A United States of America that is opposed to Israeli military action. And this does not rhyme. This is actually history repeating itself. And Netanyahu is facing some of the same issues that Eshkol faced in 1967. With a pro-Israel, generally, President Johnson was very pro-Israel. He thought that Israel was like the Alamo and the Arabs were like the Mexicans. No kidding, he used to say that. And that sounds very racist, but I didn't say it. He said it. But both these presidents were against further Israeli military action.
And in both cases, you could say that the presidents were aware that public opinion would probably be against American involvement. Like, as in the sense that Johnson would have had a problem with public opinion because of Vietnam, and Trump would say, I don't know.
67 was the year where Vietnam exploded into the streets.
And obviously, to a lesser extent, Trump would say that this is an unpopular war with his base and all this, this kind of thing.
Yeah. Right. And Johnson was also facing elections in 1968, and I can go on and on with these comparisons, but they're there. And Netanyahu has to make that decision right now. Do we stand up to this president and say, we appreciate everything you've done, but no? And we save the North, because what's at stake here is the future and the survival of the North. And I would go further. I think it's an existential issue, because we lose the North, we can lose the entire country. Now we're getting political. But what's the price you're going to pay? Right. And Eshkol had no way of knowing what the price was going to pay. Right? And America had less leverage, but Israel was completely alone back then. And by the way, Israel's pretty alone right now, as J.D. Vance reminded us this week.
That was nice.
All right? We only have one friend. And there are a lot of parallels here, Paul. A lot of parallels.
Well, okay. All right. So firstly, I want to thank Mike Oren for an amazing exposition there. But we'll have more applause. We'll have more applause later. But let's have questions. I'm going to ask a colleague. I have my colleague here, Shachar, with a mic. This gentleman here with a white baseball cap. Yeah, if you can speak into the mic. And I should say, before you start, please keep questions short and definitely a question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. How come you did not mention Begin's role in this Six-Day War?
No worry.
So, can you say that again? Sorry.
Sorry. How come you did not mention Begin's role
in the Six-Day War?
Six-Day War, yeah.
Begin, as I said before, Begin and Eshkol had a rapport, something that Ben-Gurion did not have. And I can't substantiate this in every way. I can't quantify it, but I think they liked each other and they had a mutual respect. And Begin had a very productive role in the Six-Day War in decision-making, particularly about Jerusalem. He's very adamant about Jerusalem. But one of the results of the Six-Day War and the United States' close relationship with Eshkol goes to visit Johnson at his ranch in Texas, which was a higher honor than going to the White House, was Resolution 242 of November 1967. And 242 is a story unto itself. And much of it, the text of 242 is emblazoned on my soul. And there's tremendous amount of, lack of understanding, disinformation about what's in 67. Many, many years ago, I had lunch with Jimmy Carter, and he started telling me how 242 calls for a creation of a Palestinian state, and how calls for the return of Jerusalem, and calls for Israel's return to the 67 border. And I said, Mr. President, it says none of those things. Right. Okay, but what it did say was for the return of territories conquered captured in the Six-Day War, in return for, didn't say peace, it does not call for peace with Israel and the Arab, but in return for recognizing the territorial integrity and peaceful and peace of every nation in the region. Never calls for Israeli Arab peace. By the way, Charter also called for the creation of a Palestinian state. Word Palestinian does not appear there. But, as they say in Hebrew, amama, it did call for the return of territories. And Begin didn't like it. And it was a very strong debate within the Israeli government. And Begin ended up leaving the National Unity Government over the question of territory for peace. Yeah. Just one last line. A few days after Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, the government voted to return all of the Golan Heights, most of Sinai, to Syria and Egypt in return for full peace treaties. And the response of the Arab countries was in Khartoum. The Arab Summit was the three no's: no negotiations, no peace, no recognition. Yeah. But Israel made an offer to return almost all the territories, not on Jordan, not on the West Bank, right, and Judea and Samaria, no. And the understanding of the, because I'm sorry for going on about this, but in the Resolution 242, it calls for the return of territories, not the territories. And that was the United States together with Great Britain, Lord Carradine. We're going to cut the out. The territories could be, 5 meters in Sinai, right? And the notion was that Israel had the right to live within defensible borders. And Israel pre-67 was 9 miles wide at its narrowest by Netanya. And so we needed Judea and Samaria to thicken out our border. And that was the understanding between, the subtle understanding between Eshkol and Johnson in Resolution 242.
Right, very important.
Well,
okay, lots of hands up. Someone already has a mic, I see. That's okay.
Thank you for a moment.
Colleague for initiative. Okay, make it.
Thank you for a most enlightening lecture, Mr. Oren. Quick question. You mentioned that Levi Eshkol had, a popular, or was given about 10% credit for by Israelis after the war. And you also mentioned that Moshe Dayan managed to convince him not to come down to the Kotel. And I was wondering if, in your research, or perhaps speaking to his widow, if Prime Minister Eshkol ever commented on the fact that he was almost
never
knocked out of the glory.
No, never. Not that I could find. Not interesting, though. It's a good question. Never said, why are these guys getting all these credit? How about me? That wasn't Eshkol. Great question, yeah.
And because he died in office, we also don't, he wasn't someone who had a post-office career where he could reflect and write.
Express bitterness and condemn everyone who came after
it. Right.
Ben Gurion did, lived till December 73.
Right.
Yes.
This lady down here.
Moshe Dayan gave up the Kotel, gave up the Western Wall. Why didn't Eshkol say anything? Because this was very, very significant.
He didn't give up the Western Wall. What Dayan did was to leave control over the Temple Mount to the Waqf.
Why?
And the Waqf back then was not the Waqf of today. It had some Palestinian sheikhs in it, but mostly was Jordanian. And to this day, the Jordanians have a preeminent role on the Temple Mount. I know because I spent I don't know how many months dealing with the Mughrabi Gate, that horrible structure you see over the women's section of the Kotel. We can't replace it because the Jordanians won't let us replace it. I can't believe it's all about the door. Don't ask. And Dayan's argument, and Eshkol accepted it, was that by letting the Waqf, which at that time was not very powerful, letting it have a symbolic role in controlling the Temple Mount, that will remove a casus belli between us and the Muslim world, and show that this was a battle between Arab nationalism and Israel, and not between Judaism and Islam. Okay, in retrospect, a terrible, terrible decision. And the Waqf goes on to dig out the Temple Mount, make the largest indoor mosque in the Muslim world, destroy the remnants of the first and second temple. We're still sifting through the dust that they cleared out, and almost bringing down the entire Temple Mount. So when I was ambassador, we had to deal with the bulge. Some of you may remember this, that on the southern wall, all of a sudden there's a big bulge. And what was that bulge? Because the Temple Mount is basically an artificial mount created by King Herod, right? And when you hollow it out and you still have this massive weight of the Dome of the Rock in Al-Aqsa, and on Friday afternoon, 300,000 people up there, guess what happens to those walls? Boom. And there was a real danger that the whole thing was going to come down. And I guarantee you, if that whole thing came down and I don't know how many people would have been killed, guess who was going to get blamed for it? So in cooperation with the Jordanians and in cooperation with the team of international engineers, we somehow managed to bang that bulge back into the southern wall. But that was all, in a way, an indirect ramification of Dan and Eshkol and the Israeli government's terrible decision to let the Waqf maintain control over the Temple Mount. You're absolutely right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, the gentleman in the tie here.
Mm-hmm. Oh, he's got the microphone. He's got the microphone. I hear you. Yeah.
Oh, wait. Yeah.
Eshkol was the greatest prime minister, which implies all the others were inferior.
No, I say he's the greatest. The other ones were really, really good.
My question is, what would the other prime ministers, including two of the candidates in the coming election, what do they have to learn from Levi Eshkol?
Okay, let me just because you didn't have the mic, and I want to make sure people who are watching this on the recording or on the podcast here, the question was, what do the candidates in the coming election have to learn from Levi Eshkol?
I get to learn that national unity is crucial. I mean, you ask me now, I'm going to start waxing political on you. We're facing challenges today that are every bit as daunting as anything we have faced in our history, and probably more so. With anti-Semitism on the rise, I've just come back from a tour of European capitals, and I've heard now also from Australia and Canada that much of the diaspora feels it has no future. We are isolated in the world in many ways, at least as isolated as we were in past decades. I'm not going to go into what's happening with the Democratic Party. And the greatest threat with all that we face is internal disunity in this country. By far. Because we know that when the Jewish people are united, we can overcome anything. And Eshkol was a great unifier. He was. Eshkol, by the way, removed the military occupation of the Arab communities of Israel. You know, from 1948 to 1964, Arab communities in this country were under military occupation. You know, they had the right to vote, but they were, occupied. He removed it. He brought Arabs. He brought the bones of Jabotinsky back. He was not reaching out to the other side all the time. I talked about his relationship with Begin. So that's what they have to learn. All of them. All of them. We can deal with anything if we stand together. Divided, dangerous.
Okay, yes, the gentleman here with the mic. Yeah.
Very quick. Abba Eban was the most eloquent, and we watched him on TV as teenagers. What was their relationship?
With who? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Abba Eban.
Abba Eban and
So I was telling Paul before that my friend who you hear a lot is Yossi Klein-Levy calls me the Forrest Gump of the Jewish people because I worked with Rabin, I worked with Dayan, and I was Abba Eban's last assistant. Piece of history here. And I had a great relationship with Abba Eban, but not many people did. We had Golda. We
heard about those of you who were here for Meryl Mazzini's talk about Golda would have heard their very, very strong animosity between Abba Eban and Golda Meir.
I was telling Paul a story that they came to Golda and said, guess Abba Eban wants to be the prime minister of Israel. She said, very interesting. Of what? Wants to be prime minister. And Golda said, very interesting. Of what country?
Okay.
And I want to go back to it. I could go on for an hour on this one because another reason I got to be ambassador when I went for my interview with Netanyahu, he said, "What do you think of Abba Eban?" Because he did not have a high opinion of Abba Eban. No one did. And I said he was the world's worst ambassador. Ambassador must never do what Abba Eban did. Twice in 1956 and again in 1967, he was given terms of reference by the Israeli government, instructions. And he went to the Americans and he went to them and said, here are my terms of reference. I don't agree with them. Here's what I think.
Wow.
Which an ambassador must never, ever do. Bibi liked that. So people did not have very good relationship with him, but he was a diplomat and is certainly in a league of his own, a great polyglot. We were working together when he died on a book of his meetings with famous people, including de Gaulle and Kennedy and everybody he knew. And it was fascinating working with him. We had a very good relationship. And you should know, he was, I always say, apropos of what Josie said about me being the Forrest Gump of the Jewish people, I've worked with all the Herzogs. I worked with Chaim Herzog, I worked with Bougie, I certainly worked with Mike Herzog, who was the ambassador, great guy. But people don't know that Abi Ibn was also Bougie's uncle. And yes, his mother and Bougie's mother were sisters from Cairo, by the way, and from Egyptian. So I've worked with all the Herzogs.
Yes, gentleman here.
Mi amigo.
As you know, English is not my language, but I'll try the best.
Okay.
And when you spoke about the Six-Day War, there were three names that I didn't hear, which I believe were very important. One was Ezer Weizmann and Chaim Herzog, and of course, the general in the Sinai campaign.
So Ezer Weizmann was the head of operations, and he was in many ways the architect of that extraordinary Israeli operation to knock out the Egyptian Air Force. He was not the commander of the Israeli Air Force at that time, but he was the head of operations. And he approved that mission. But he had a very bitter falling out with Yitzhak Rabin. What happened? Listen to this story. Let me just say about Chaim Herzog, who I worked with also, was Dovel Tzahal back then. He was in charge of he was the army spokesperson. He wasn't actually in command of troops, but a very good spokesperson. Rabin had a physical and nervous breakdown. And Ezer Weizmann came to Eshkol and said, listen, this guy's he's not functioning. Let me be the chief of staff. And Rabin heard about this and never forgave Ezer Weizmann. And he got his revenge during the Oslo process because Ezer Weizmann went from being a right-wing person to a left-wing person and very much wanted to be in the Oslo process. And Rabin kept him out. He iced him out. Weizmann got his revenge at Rabin's funeral. I was there.
President at this point, right?
I was present by mentioning that Yitzhak Rabin liked whiskey. Welcome to Israeli history, folks. All right. I worked with Ezer Weizmann too, Forrest Gump, and that's another story.
Okay. Okay. We have a lot of questions still. We're going to go for another few minutes, I think. Oh, also Arik Sharon, he wanted to.
Arik Sharon was the person who pressed Eshkol to go to war all the time, and the future of the Jewish people was at stake. He led forces into Sinai. There were three prongs of the Israeli army into Sinai. It's very interesting. In October, at the end of October 2023, the army went in three prongs into Gaza, and Arik Sharon was very successful in knocking out that first line of Egyptian defense in Sinai. And later went on, to be a great hero in 1973. And I never worked with Arik Sharon. Somebody.
By the way, we're going to be having obviously discussion about Arik Sharon in this series, and we're having a later series about the president. So we'll also have discussions about Chaim Herzog and Ezer Weizmann. Right. Okay, there was a gentleman here in the blue shirt. Yeah, if you can stick your hand, yeah, you with your beard and blue shirt. Just wait for the mic.
What would you say was the posture of the American Jewish communal leadership in late May 1967? And how would you compare it similarly or dissimilarly to American Jewish communal leadership now?
What was the position of the American Jewish community? It's going to shock you, my answer. Okay. In May 1967, American Jews went out to protest. Not in favor of Israel, but against the Vietnam War. American Jewish organizations, including major American Jewish organizations like American Jewish Committee, were not particularly pro-Israel. and didn't come out and say John's administration has to save the state of Israel? Not much. Everything changed after 67. That was the watershed when all these organizations became very, very pro-Israel. And today, I've been following very closely the reaction of American Jewish organizations to the deal. Many of the organizations have come out and expressed reservations, sometimes very strong reservations. And I must say the strongest reservation, I was surprised to see this, was by Mort Klein of the ZOA. I wouldn't have expected, very strong. RJC came out in favor of the deal. And so, it's a thing, what can I say? But I think the American Jewish community today is facing, again, challenges. I'm going to plug another book of mine. It's called Ally.
It's a great book.
And it's my memoir of growing up in America and being ambassador in Washington. But I talk about growing up the only Jewish kid in a Sicilian neighborhood and getting beaten up every day by anti-Semites. When the book came out a decade ago, American Jews said to me, "What are you talking about? There's no anti-Semitism in this country. You made up this whole, right, you made up this whole up." No one says that anymore. Nobody says that anymore. So American Jews are facing challenges. In many ways, I think I can speak for myself and a couple other people who are here who might be in my generation. We grew up in the golden age of American Jewry. Golden age. I'm giving a talk at the library, the Israel National Library, when? On the 6th? I'm talking about the history of American Jewry and for the 250th anniversary. And it's I'll be talking about what it was growing up in the most affluent and secure, prosperous period in Jewish history, which was the American Jewish community between the 1950s and pretty much today, and whether that is ended now. And well, today, different than 67.
Okay, gentleman here in the front.
You had a question to this lady here.
Woman, so
Yeah, you had a question. We'll get both of you.
we'll get both of you, yeah, exactly.
How is Israeli education dealing with Prime Minister Eshkol? You're claiming he's the best prime minister. How has he dealt with in Israeli?
Israeli education has done great justice for Eshkol now. They figure him in the history books in the way they haven't. Those of you who live in Jerusalem, like most of you, can visit the Eshkol Library in Rehavia. It's interesting, like and learn more about him. But yes, Israeli kids now know much more about Eshkol than they did in the past.
Okay, yes.
Amen?
Yes.
Okay, my question's actually changed listening to what you've said to other people, but it's twofold. The first thing is, when you talk about 67 and you say we were more united.
Can you hold it a bit closer?
Oh, sorry. Hello? Thanks.
Yeah.
When you talk about 67 and you say we were more united, is it really fair to compare the kind of country we're living in now to 67? It was a much more simple time. There weren't so many distractions. There weren't so many different groups. Now we're living in a time where people know much more. There's far more global interference in various things. I'm just wondering if basically the sign of a more sophisticated society and a more advanced world, if you can call it that, is what's led to many more factions and a much more complicated situation.
Definitely. And there's no social media. Israel did not have television in 1967, folks. Did not.
Exactly.
Had a couple of radio stations. Everyone listened to the same radio station.
And the second
But
part,
Israel, people used to, when you're meeting Israelis of a certain generation, they say, "Oh, if we only go back to 67, everything was so good in 67." 67, women had almost no role in Israeli leadership, except for Golda. That Mizrahim were downtrodden and looked down upon, tremendous amount of prejudice. The thought that you would have a Mizrahi Ramatkal or a prime minister or a president was unthinkable. And Arabs were empowered in 1967? No, quiet. And Haredim. Right on. Haredim would never challenge the state back then. Never. So we are in, to use a very fancy word, we're in a fripperous period where there's many divisions within our society. And that wasn't the case in it was a simpler time in that way. Certainly simpler time.
thank you for clarifying that. And the second part was really to say whether you think it's inevitable at some stage that Netanyahu will end up having to be a fall guy for basically a chance for Israel to kind of have a second wave with the world. That basically he's going to be forced at some point to be a casualty.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. I'm sorry.
Netanyahu will be the fall guy to enable
To enable relations with the Western world to move forward.
That's now you're asking me a political question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And not just a political, let's say a contemporary commentary. And this is a discussion I have with many of my colleagues who are dealing with contemporary issues. And we pretty much agree that were Netanyahu not to win the elections this fall, we have a different prime minister with a different government, Israel would have a grace period of about 3 weeks. That if there's a different government, a Bennett government, an Eisenkot government, I don't know, that Israel would have a grace period of about 3 weeks. Why? Because for the vast majority of our detractors in the world, it's no longer what we do, but who we are. And we're not about to change that.
Okay.
Moreover, there's a moreover to this. The next government is not going to make radically different policy changes. Not with regard to Gaza, not with regard to Lebanon. It's not going to create a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria. It's not going to redivide Jerusalem. And even if it did, it wouldn't make all that much difference. I'm telling you. And that's a very sober analysis of where we are. I'd go further. During the war, the actual stages of the war, any Israeli prime minister would have taken 95% of the same, or 95 decisions taken to the war were made by an Israeli prime minister. And I say that without prejudice or favor to any Israeli leader, Bibi or otherwise. These are national issues. And with regard to the Haredim, yes, I could be very material differences. But on issues of national security, what? Is there going to be another prime minister who's not going to stand up for the North? Who's going to give in to American pressure? There's another prime minister who would have not gone into Gaza with our ground forces. There's another prime minister who would not have tried to convince the United States to join us in fighting an existential threat. No. The same. Sometimes you run this country, you're running the country. It's the same country. With the same problem. Look at these people way back there.
Okay, this will have to be the last question, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry, Paul, I'm just going to, give me 1, 2, and I'll take both.
Okay, fine. So let's do two. Yeah, so let's do both together.
Very quickly.
And make them short.
Greetings from Sydney, Australia. I wanted to ask you, at the very beginning of tonight's talk, you mentioned that Israel needs more of a manager than a leader. Can you circle back to that?
Okay. Well, that's what he said. Go ahead, go, please.
Let's go for let's have the other question as well, and Michael Oren will answer both.
Okay.
Yes, the gentleman. Can you stick your hand up? Yeah. Wait for the mic. Thanks.
Since we've deviated to contemporary issues, during the 12-day war last year, you wrote an article regarding, you asked, I think when you were the ambassador to, was it George W. Bush, if they could lend you a B-52 bomber?
I didn't understand a word of that.
And we would take on the job of flying it over to Tehran and taking out the targets that were required, particularly the Nordau site. Do you still see a situation today, after what has happened in the last 12 months, where that would be relevant?
So the question was, you wrote an article during the June war in which you wrote that
as it so happens, I think George W. Bush refused the offer.
I can't hear either of you right now, so hold on.
Just a second. Yeah. I'm just repeating the question. So the question was, as I understand it, that you're referring to an article that Ambassador Oren wrote during the June war, in which he requested from the United States to let Israel use one of the American bombers to do the bombing themselves of Nordau. And is that idea still relevant now?
It's a project I took on over the last decade, not just last June. I've been trying to convince various administrations of the United States to either sell us, rent us, or lease us a B-2 bomber. No, they're not there. Those are those are refuelers, but okay. And I have, the Obama people said no. The Trump people in the first administration said maybe. And to this day, I think that it would send an unequivocal message to Iran, have that ability. They haven't given it to us because they know we might actually use it. But it's still very much in the book. And I've written about it recently, by the way, not just last summer. I've written about it again. Going back to your question about, it's a good way of ending too. Thank you. What do we need now? Do we need it? First of all, was Eshkol just a manager and not a leader? And I would take issue with that. I think Eshkol goes to meet Johnson at his ranch. This is in 1968. And I want you should read what he says to Johnson. He says, I'm not coming to you as a victor. I'm not coming here to take a victory lap. I'm coming to you as a man of peace. And I'm here to discuss seriously how to make peace. Here was a man who was a leader. That's not a manager. That's a visionary. And yes, he was a great manager, but he was also a great leader at the time when Israel needed leadership. And this is precisely what we need today. We need managers. We need people who can unite this country because that to me is an existential issue. And we need leaders with a vision of this country's future. My last event here at the Beckon Center was for not a book I wrote. It's an extended essay called Israel 2048, it's a book in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. You can read, you can choose your language. And it's a vision of Israel on our 100th birthday, 2048, on 22 chapters in every field. But we need people to discuss that. Where do we want to be? Our 100th anniversary is coming up, right? And 20 years is a young person's idea of what a long time is. And it's coming up because some of us remember the 70th, we remember the 75th, we remember the 50th, I remember the 25th. It's coming up. And what do we want for this country? What do we want for our education? What do we want for our relationship with our neighbors? What do we want with our relationship with the minorities in this country? What do we want relationship between Israel and the Jewish and Judaism and the Jewish people and the diaspora? What do we want? And this is a discussion which we must have now. But to have that discussion, you really need leaders to say, okay, let's have the discussion. Let's be open to different ideas, but we have to make a decision. And I think that is, I think about where we are today, and sometimes I think, if only Levi Eshkol were alive today, what would he do? Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you to Michael Oren for helping us understand Levi Eshkol and a lot more as well. Thank you all for coming. The next in this series is in 2 weeks' time, the 5th of July. Another ambassador to the United States, Itamar Rabinovich, will be talking about Yitzhak Rabin in 2 weeks' time. Also, you will have seen flyers outside. We have an event this Wednesday, the 24th, a screening of a documentary, an acclaimed documentary about Yitzhak Shamir, with a star-studded panel discussion afterwards. So please join us for that as well. You can book online or just show up afterwards. Thank you.